This is the City of God podcast, where Christ meets culture. Welcome to the City of God podcast, where we are weekly discussing today's biggest cultural issues, all through the lens of God's infallible word. My name is Rob Pacienza, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, John Rabe. John, great to see you, man.
Great to see you, Rob. I'm always excited every week when we do this podcast because we just get to talk to great people, and it's just exciting for me to get to ask questions to people I admire so much. But this week, and I've said this before, but this might be the most excited that I've been, and I mean it, because our guest today is somebody that we at the ministry have been trying to get for an interview for a long time, and it just hasn't worked out, but we finally got things set up recently, and she was able to join us, and I just admire her from top to bottom, one of the smartest thinkers in Christianity, and somebody who's cutting against the tide. And you can tell us more about who she is and who we're talking to.
Yeah, absolutely. We're talking today to Rosaria Butterfield. She is a best-selling author and speaker, and she has an incredible testimony. Actually, she's documented her testimony, but she's also working on a new work that I think's been recently released, 5 Lies of Our Anti-Christian Age. But more importantly than her recent work, it's the story of God's redemption in her life.
Yes.
This is a former professor of English and women's studies at Syracuse University. During that time, she was an advocate for feminist philosophy and queer theory, and she too herself was a practicing homosexual, married to another woman. And
Full lifestyle. And just to hear about God's story of redeeming grace in her life, the Hound of Heaven, just pursuing her. I mean, her whole agenda at the time was to disprove Christianity, to show how it was oppressive against minorities, including the LGBTQ community. And instead of trying to debunk and to kind of throw fire, onto the conversation, or the divisive conversation about how Christianity is divisive in America, she comes to a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ herself, has a complete transformation, and now today is an advocate for God's design concerning gender and sexuality. And a strong advocate. I mean, she pulls no punches, as you'll hear in this interview. But that's the amazing thing, that she was fully immersed in the homosexual lifestyle. A pastor and his wife simply showed her hospitality, started inviting her to dinner at their home. She became friends with them, and they shared with her over time the gospel. She received Christ, and there's just been a complete change in her. She is now a married, homeschooling mother. Her husband is a pastor. They have a number of children together, and just a complete change. But seeing what's going on in the culture right now and having the background that she does uniquely positions her to talk about these things. And as you'll hear in the interview, she gets right into it. I mean, she does not tiptoe through the tulip field, so to speak. She goes right at it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's one thing for someone to have the testimony that she has, to come to Christ, to leave the lifestyle she was in, but then she would have had every right to just kind of stay quiet, and just go on with her life in a peaceful and private manner. But she has done the opposite of that. She has become a public figure, talking about God, the culture's assault on God's design concerning gender and sexuality, biblical manhood and biblical womanhood, and she has become a champion. And I'm really excited, as we'll talk about on the interview today, that we will be having her live in person at the 2024 Kingdom Come Conference, which will be March 14th through 16th at Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church. So excited to interview her today, and excited to bring her down to Fort Lauderdale in March. So without further ado, here is our City of God interview with Rosaria Butterfield. Rosaria, so good to have you on the City of God podcast today.
It is a joy and pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
We have you coming down to Fort Lauderdale for the Kingdom Come Conference, which is going to be March 14th through the 16th of 2024. And the theme of that conference is standing for truth in an upside-down world. In what ways can we really see an upside-down world in the 21st century?
Right. One of the clearest ways is if you turn to your Bibles to Romans 1, and you see in Romans 1 there are three exchanges that God talks about, and all three of those exchanges have now been codified into law. So truth has become lies. Heterosexuality has been given over its normative position to homosexuality, and the worship of God has been functionally replaced by the worship of idols. And now sometimes people will say, like, well, come on, Rosaria, it's always been that way. No. In a post-Obergefell world, all of those exchanges have been codified into the law of the land. And that's the important thing to think about. So in the Obergefell decision, which was the 2015 decision that legalized gay rights in all 50 states, it also included something called a dignitary harm clause. That means that it redefined the legal definition of harm. It means that you are harming someone who identifies him or herself by the letters LGBTQ and the symbol plus. You are harming that person not by denying them a material good like a job or a pizza, but by failing to affirm their identity. So if Christians want to know why people are losing their jobs for not using preferred pronouns, that's why. So we live in an upside down world because the three exchanges in Romans 1 have become codified into the law of the land. And most Christians I talk to don't seem to know that.
A brilliant answer.
It really is. I want to get into your personal story, and you've written a new book that we're very excited about. But just to follow up on that, this idea of dignitary harm, I know there was a book recently, and when I say recently, the last 5 years written, called The Coddling of the American Mind. And we see this fragility that plays such a part now in our public debates where disagreement is hate, and if you disagree with me, you have to be silenced because you're threatening me. You have a background as a feminist college professor, so you have the campus experience as well. What do you see that has happened over the past couple of decades that has led us to this point where disagreement is now harm?
Yeah. So first of all, I mean, you all know this, but I'm the problem, right? This is the world I helped create. I was a gay rights activist. I was a lesbian. I was tenured in queer theory and women's studies and English literature. I was hired and mentored by Syracuse University to make homosexuality look wholesome, and unfortunately, I pulled it off. So I'm going to talk about all these things. We're going to slay all these sacred cows, but the blood's still on my hands. I did this. So let's not forget that. But one of the things that you definitely see as we're shifting, and I've been really thinking about this because I've been testifying before the legislature and speaking to Durham school board meetings on transgenderism and parental rights, which, that's a freak show in so many ways. And it's really different because 35 years ago, when I was on their side, we would always put forward the lawyers, the PhDs, and the doctors, and we kept the lunatics at home. Now, everybody wants their lunatic at the microphone, and this is a really good question. Like, why did we think that was a good idea? And I think Carl Trueman's book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, explains it, that expressive individualism has become a replacement for the image bearing of a holy God, which is the standard for personhood. And so you see this confusion in the world and in the church. So how does truth get exchanged? I remember maybe it was 10 years ago. It was post Obergefell, maybe 2016, speaking at on a Christian college campus. You can put that in scare quotes if you'd like. And I was sharing my testimony, and part of my testimony is that when I was a gay rights activist, I had a drag queen friend with whom I would talk about Jesus. And I know that sounds kind of nuts, but if you ever wanted to know what gay rights activists talk about in the kitchen, you just come to my former kitchen. Eternity is written into the hearts of men. So I'd shared in my testimony that my friend, whose actual name was Matthew, but went by the name Jill, put a large hand over my hand as we were talking about faith and life. And afterwards, a student jumped up and raised her hand. Dr. Butterfield, you hate transgendered people. I know it because you said your transgendered friends' hands were large. And I said, well, I'm 5'2". I barely cover an octave on a piano. Comparatively speaking, a biological male who stands 6'4", hands are large. Oh, you did it again. You did it again. And I said, well, but it's true. It's just objectively true. And the student jumped up and said, but your truth hurts my reality. And I thought that was a very interesting moment. She wasn't saying that it wasn't true. She was saying she wasn't rejecting the truth because it was false. She was rejecting the truth because it hurts. Now, if this nonsense had just stayed in the world, we might be okay. But it slipped into the evangelical church through books and podcasts, parachurch ministries. I can quote, I've got the receipts if you'd like. Somehow this idea that it's God's truth is somehow not enough. The personal experience and especially the emotional pain of imagined victims are the people who really need to share share the stage here. And so I think whenever truth is rejected, not because it's untrue, but because it hurts, we're in trouble. And now that parachurch ministries and broad evangelicals are on this bandwagon, what I think we need to do is go right to the hottest part in the battle. We need to have this fight right here. But, it's hard to get evangelicals in a fighting mood, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Rosaria, you briefly mentioned, what you spent so much of your time in your early career doing as an activist, as a professor, advancing queer theory. And part of your agenda was to show how Christianity had been used to really suppress and oppress the homosexual and transgender movement. Right. But God had other plans for you in your life. Share with our audience briefly how the gospel of Jesus Christ transformed you and your testimony of incredible transformation through the grace of God.
Yeah, well, I can't do that briefly, so I'm going to have to just do that badly. So I've written one whole book on it, and then there's a pretty big chunk of a section in the new book specifically on the exact conversations that Ken Smith and I had. And Pastor Ken Smith was my neighbor who wrote to me personally when I had written an article in the local newspaper that was hateful about Christianity. And he offered to meet with me. And I thought that was awesome because I was writing a book on the religious right, basically wondering why people like you hated the person I used to be. And I thought, aha, here's my unpaid research assistant. So I was happy to spend time with Ken and his wife, Floy. And in the process of having hundreds of meals at his house and reading through the Bible 7 times and just genuinely, genuinely asking and answering the questions that I had, the Holy Spirit convicted me of my sin and also convicted me of the truth of our crucified and resurrected Lord. And that was a truth over which I had no interpretive power. So it was a truth that just took me out of the game, as it were. I wasn't sure what would happen next when I committed my life to Jesus, truly. I didn't know if how the Lord was going to deal with my persistent lesbian feelings and a whole host of other things. I used to tell people, look, folks, I'm tenured in sin. So what do what's going to happen? But, as is the Lord's way, he made a perfect path for me. And I look back on those years. These are decades ago. I have been biblically married to my husband, Kent Butterfield, who has also been my pastor for all of these years. I have been biblically married for almost as long as I've been a Christian. And that was that was clearly one of the ways that God gave me rescue and refuge and healing and victory. And yet that story is almost anathema in the broad evangelical church that wants to elevate singleness above marriage, that introduces the heresy of gay Christianity, side A or side B. It's the same theology, it's the same doctrine, it's the same heresy. And I think about these things because if I had come into the church today and I had some wacko evangelical pastor say to me, "We're so glad you're here. You know, we need a gay bowling league in our church, and here's a Revoice conference." And, you know, there's nothing that would have offered me that the New York Times and a Starbucks doesn't already. So doctrine matters. And the fact that, again, these parachurch ministries have been led by the nose to somehow think that it's loving to coddle someone's sin is anti-Christian, and it's vile. I don't have strong opinions, as you can tell.
Exactly.
So I'm going to try to stop being so vague with you, brothers.
Please.
No, I love your bold convictions and your strong opinions, because you have been such a blessing to so many that have been wrestling through these ideas in broader evangelicalism. As you know, I'm a PCA pastor. This issue has been front and center for the last 5 or so years with the Revoice conference that you just mentioned. And so much of the debate has been around, yes, we can all agree that the gospel leads to justification, but when it comes to sanctification, it's really for those that want to embrace that you can still have same-sex attraction and it's okay, and same-sex attraction and homosexual feelings are permissible for the Christian life. Really, it came down to, does the gospel have the power to sanctify the Christian? Is sanctification the mortification of sin, or is it just sin management? And your testimony has been living proof that no, the gospel has not only the power to justify us before a holy God, but also put to death the deeds of the flesh. And so we are so grateful for you.
Could I just say my testimony and thousands of others who don't want to deal with the hand-wringing wrath of the panty waists in the PCA, who can't tolerate that a resurrected Christ actually gives you power. So it's a mess. I don't have to tell you that.
No.
And these stories of deliverance are frankly a threat to this LGBTQ plus movement. And I know you've experienced that, Rosaria. And by the way, for those who want to know more, your early book, Secret Thoughts of an Unlikely Convert, you lay all of this out in the process that you went through. It's extraordinary and encouraging. You're a wife, you're a mother, you're a church member. I get the sense that you are not, and by any means, by nature, a polemicist, but you have been pulled into this and really uniquely equipped, I think, by God to deal with some of these issues. And you have written a new book, 5 Lies of Our Anti-Christian Age. I'm sure you wish you had other things that you were writing about instead, but it really is, this is something that's demanded right now, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I tried to get almost anybody else to write this book. I thought Carl Trueman would be the one who would do it, but I just couldn't convince anyone else to write it. So that's where we are exactly.
And so as we look through that book, some of the major lies that you deal with, or some of them we have already touched upon on this program, and some of them we haven't. I'd like to look at a little bit the issue of feminism, because we've dealt with some of the LGBTQ stuff already. But as a former lesbian and a former feminist, feminism is sort of the gateway drug maybe that takes us to a lot of these other things. And yet, to talk to even your average evangelical now, they would sort of identify, they may not use the term feminism, but they would sort of fall on the side of feminism. Tell us a little bit about how feminism is a dangerous lie to the church.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, first of all, feminism relies on a false distinction between sex and gender. So feminism, from the, just right out of the box, doesn't look at the creation ordinance and say, yeah, that is good. That is good. Now, in its early years, feminism advocated for citizenship and education, which we wouldn't disagree with.
Sure.
But we also wouldn't say that we needed feminism to get that. So in some ways, feminism is credited with something that isn't necessarily the domain of the feminist. But the sex-gender distinction is a really big problem. It suggests that that your biological sex is one thing, but it has no patterned purpose, therefore no cultural application or what a feminist would call gender. And one of the ways that you can see that particular sex-gender distinction being played out today is in the transgender movement, which simply takes that sex-gender distinction and moves it to its most obvious conclusion, suggesting that biological sex is different than gender and that personhood is somehow attached in how you want to manifest your gender. And so where the early feminist would say, well, I have no problem being a woman. I just need to be at war with babies and men because that's a problem. We don't. My biological ability to be a creator. Oh, I don't want that, and I certainly don't want men in charge. That would be terrible. Now we see it really played out in transgenderism, where there's a complete breakage between sex and gender, with gender becoming the do whatever you want approach to life. And, if you don't like biblical patriarchy, I don't like the term complementarian. It's too clunky for me. So I like biblical patriarchy. If you don't like the idea that God says that wives are to be submitted to their husbands, that husbands are to be the heads and the protectors, and women are to be the nurturers. Husbands are to be the providers, and the women are to be the caregivers in the home. And if you don't like the idea of male headship in your church in all relevant ways, how do you feel about transgender patriarchy? Because that's what we see today. In fact, I would argue that feminism in the world is dead. Transgenderism killed it. Title IX now supports, advances, advocates for quote unquote trans women, that's biological men, having full access to women's sports and women's locker rooms. So, if you reject biblical patriarchy, you just might get transgender patriarchy, which is where we are right now. The only place I can see that feminism is alive and well is in the broad evangelical church. And what that tells me is that the broad evangelical church is not leading the world. It's kind of jogging about 5 miles behind in the 12K or whatever.
Interesting. Rosaria, I'm not only a pastor, but I'm a father of 2 children. And so this topic of gender confusion and the culture's assault on God's design for sexuality and gender hits close to home. As I have a 10 and 12-year-old at home, I'm thinking about the world they're growing up in. How is the culture attacking and assaulting and directing this message directly to the next generation? And why should we be concerned about it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm speaking as somebody who speaks to school boards about this. So, I can tell you stories. Do you remember about 30 years ago, the gay rights movement talked a lot about leaving consenting adults alone?
Absolutely.
You haven't heard that in a long time, have you? And there's a reason. In order to to build momentum as a movement and to look at people who live in perversion and sexual sin as sexual minorities deserving of civil rights, in order to actually make that case to a watching world, you had to have allies. Allies would be heterosexual folks who would say, well, I guess love is love. I don't know. Who am I to judge? The allies of 30 years ago are the groomers of today. You haven't heard leave consenting adults alone because we're not talking about adults. We're talking about the trans child, which Christopher Rufo brilliantly talks about as the totem of American culture. The totem, like the organic head of the boar you put on a stick and march underneath it.
Yeah.
So allies have become groomers and children are targets. And you see that with Disney. You see that with the Blue's Clues Pride Parade with Nina West. And you see this with this complete cultural invention of the transgender child. There is no transgender child. Yes, a child can have gender anxiety in the same way that a child could have anorexia. That's the medical analog. But you would never turn to your daughter with anorexia and say, yeah, I need to affirm your fatness. And what you really need is a sticker and a parade and you're going to feel better. It's absurd. Even the APA, which is a pretty liberal, organization in lots of ways, very politically motivated, even it says that 73% of the time, a child's gender anxiety, if that child actually has that, will be resolved by natal normal puberty if social transitioning, cross-sex hormones, and surgery are not introduced. So, you're just it's satanic, is what it is. It's a satanic attack against the family. And here's where Christians need to enter this conversation, because again, when you spend any time in the political realm, somebody's going to hold up pictures of the woman who the 13-year-old who got the double mastectomy and the 14-year-old boy with the castration. These are really horrible things to look at. And from a Christian perspective, we don't throw people away. We don't hold up people as an example of what not to be. The people in my life who most understand the resurrection of Jesus at this point are Christians who are detransitioners. Mm-hmm. And they are longing for the time when they have a resurrected body, knowing that they could not mock God as much as they tried in their youth. What do you say to the dad who has castrated his 14-year-old son in the name of Joe Biden's interpretation of the 14th Amendment? Only a Christian has anything to say to him. So these are very serious times, and children are the target. And for that reason, I am very upset with these parachurch ministries who can't find the gumption to say, this is evil, this is wrong, don't do it. Transgenderism is a sin. It's an attack against the creation ordinance. It's the sin of envy. It's the violation of the 10th commandment. And instead, all these guys just want to be a soft presence here in Sodom. Well, over my dead body in some ways. Yeah, because we got to have the fight in the street now, folks.
Amen. I love your perspective, and I'm so glad you made that point. This debate for the Church of Jesus Christ can't merely be political. We've got to show our people this is a gospel issue. The glory of God is being assaulted. The gospel is being assaulted when we attack God's design for gender and sexuality. And I think that's such an important, and ultimately, as I tell our congregation all the time, homosexuals and heterosexuals are struggling with the same thing. It's about identity. Do we find our identity in the world, or do I identify our identity ultimately in Christ? And we need to show a generation out there that is struggling with gender dysphoria, that is struggling with these issues, that you find your hope and your resurrection and your identity ultimately in Jesus Christ. And He is the one that completes you and fully satisfies you.
Yep. Could I add one thing to that, though?
Absolutely.
We want to make a distinction between gender dysphoria, which is a medical illness. Now, all my ACBC friends are like, "Don't say that," but the but the APA says it, so we're going to go with that.
Yeah.
We're going to go with that. And transgenderism, which is a political ideology becoming a social contagion, with your government schools leading the charge because of a 2021 anti-bullying federal mandate to be taught in the schools. And if it's anti-bullying and it's federal and it's a mandate, as a parent, you can't remove your child. So that's the one thing. The other thing is, it's not quite the same. I wouldn't say actually that heterosexuals and homosexuals are struggling quite with the same thing. And the reason I would say this is just this, and I'm not trying to challenge you because
No,
you're the
this is
pastor.
good.
I'm the English professor.
Yeah.
I am not a preacher chick wannabe. I don't, but I think about ideas. And so here's what I would say. I would say that homosexuality is not just a sin of practice. It is a sin of practice, whether it's your desire or you're actually in bed with somebody.
Yes.
Your desire is a form of practice. Our confession says the will is in it, even if it's unchosen. So it is it is certainly a sin of practice, but the sin of homosexuality is also a sin against the pattern of the creation ordinance. And because the seeds of the garden are in the gospel, it is a different sin. Now, does the blood of Christ cleanse away all sin? Absolutely. But the nature of the sin is it's different, and I think it would be helpful to register this. So to that end, I would say there's no such thing as a gay person. There's no such thing as a transgendered person in terms of the ontological category of biblical personhood. And that is because image bearing is wrapped up in fact, growing in the knowledge and the righteousness and the holiness of God. Whereas transgenderism and homosexuality are part of the world, the flesh, and the devil.
That's good.
Excellent, excellent, and very helpful clarifications. The book, again, is 5 Lies of Our Anti-Christian Age. It's published by Crossway. It's out now, and we are about out of the time that we have with you, Rosaria, but I do want to just ask you, as we get ready to close, how is it that these ideas have made their way into the evangelical church? We've seen it, you start to expect to see things like the Sparkle Creed, in some crazy liberal denomination, but how is this stuff making inroads into what are self-professed evangelical churches?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, first of all, self-professed evangelical churches are not using the confessions and the creeds that we have. And so, in some ways, to give them the benefit of the doubt, the tsunami of sexual sin took them out like they were a little rowboat in a sea in a tempestuous storm using their toothbrush as an oar. So the doctrine was weak. But then I would add to that many of these evangelical churches are so bound up in pleasing these parachurch ministries that you've just got hirelings and more hirelings. And here's what I know. I'm part of a denomination where my pastor, who's my husband, and our elders took a vow to die for the doctrine of the Bible. And I would venture to say that your church would do the same thing. These parachurch, CEOs took no such vow. And it got hot out there. And while the gospel frees you from the fear of man, I don't think that they really cared to have a fight. Because here's the thing, when you really see that this is spiritual warfare, and when you actually see that you are living out Ephesians 6, 1 Peter 5, this is real. Satan knows your name, he knows your address. You have to be willing to suffer for the gospel. I mean, I tell everyone, a good prayer in the morning is, Lord, please protect me. And if I lose my job today for your sake, may it go to the glory of God. You have to be ready to not be a hireling. But I think these guys, they just really are. I mean, I personally don't think that any mega church is going to make it. Because if you have to please men, that's not going to go well right now.
Nope.
It's a hard go for us. We know it.
Absolutely. I love that you put it in the perspective, once again, that this is a spiritual battle. I know when I talk about the assault on God's design for gender and sexuality, I say it's demonic, it's spiritual warfare. Some people cringe. They go, wow, is it really that bad? And I think to put it in any other perspective actually totally diminishes what is happening in the 21st century. We've got to elevate the conversation to the perspective of showing our congregations and the church in North America in particular, this is much bigger and greater than we even realize.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Amen. And the Lord is bigger and greater than we realize.
Absolutely.
And the sword of the Spirit is bigger and greater than we realize. But how many churches have given up their Wednesday night prayer meeting for nonsense? Are we really appealing to the means of grace? I hope we are. We need to. And my hope is that, whatever small part I get to play in this conference coming up would be encouraging Christians to pick up that sword of the Spirit and to take it out to the world. There's no place to hide anyway. You're not going to be safe by hiding, under your desk anyway. So join the party. It's not so bad out there, really.
Yep. Well, we are so grateful for your ministry and for your voice. And once again, looking so forward to having you in Fort Lauderdale, March 14th through the 16th for the Kingdom Come Conference, which is hosted at Coral Ridge Presbyterian Church in Fort Lauderdale. And you are a leading expert in so many of the topics that we talked about today, particularly for the North American Church. I even learned so much just talking to you briefly today, but God be with you, and thank you so much for your voice in this cultural moment.
Thank you so much.
Lord bless you, brothers. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the City of God podcast and our interview with Rosaria Butterfield. If you enjoyed this interview, believe it was encouraging to you and inspiring, we pray that you would pass this along to family and friends as we together understand what it means to tackle today's biggest cultural issues all through the lens of God's infallible word. And until next time, I pray that God richly blesses you. The City of God podcast is produced by Coral Ridge Ministries and made in partnership with the Institute for Faith and Culture. Visit us at cityofgodpodcast.com to access all of our previous episodes. You can also listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, or anywhere you get podcasts. A full video version of this podcast is available on YouTube. This is the City of God podcast, where Christ meets culture.